Hello to my GCSE class. Well done on your work so far with Sonata Form, Clarinet Concerto by Mozart, Clarinet Concerto in A major. We're going to continue looking at it today, and I wanted to go into a bit of detail about two sections. One is solo exposition, and the other is recapitulation. Now, both of these sections, as you can see and as you already know, begin with the first subject. And we've listened to that many times in lessons, gone into detail. Today, we're going to have a look at the second subject in each section. There it is. And I want you to not just intellectually understand what's going on, but also to sort of connect with the sound of the second subject, to hear it as well. As soon as it appears, you can identify it just from the first few notes, really. Very quickly, I'd like to recap the larger sections of sonata form that we already talked about. Now, the first of these sections is, of course, exposition. In this concerto, exposition really happens twice, first as orchestral and then as solo instrument exposition, presented by the clarinet. The second large section of sonata form and of this piece is the development section. And the job of the development section is to develop the material that's been presented earlier. For now, that's all I'm going to tell you about it, as we'll study development in more detail later on. Finally, the third large section of sonata form and this piece is recapitulation. Its job is to bring back the material originally heard in the exposition section. And so here's the big picture of sonata form: exposition, development, recapitulation. And for us to memorize second subject properly, we need to look at the first and third sections today, and we're going to hear the way second subject is treated in the exposition and in recapitulation. Firstly, let's listen to the second subject in the exposition. It starts with a melody in the clarinet part in bar 100. There it is. Now let's hear the same theme, second subject, in the recapitulation section. Again, it starts with this melody in the clarinet part, so follow it along. Before we carry on, you might find it confusing that you're hearing all these notes in the clarinet part, when in fact there's just that one note there. Actually, there's a reason for that, which is there's a pause there, implying that the clarinetist would do an improvised passage or a decoration of their own choice. The edition we're using actually gives a footnote there, suggesting what the decoration should be. But on the recording, you hear something different still. So let's just listen to that section one more time and follow it along this time, knowing what's going on. Now let's hear the ending of the second subject in the exposition section. No arrows this time. Notice what happens. This is just a small detail to be aware of. It may or may not come up in the exam. Now we're going to listen to the beginning of each time the second subject occurs, which is only twice throughout the piece. Here it is in the exposition. And in recapitulation. Listen to the start of each one closely again. They are, of course, in two different keys. The exposition second subject is in the dominant key, and the recapitulation second subject is in the tonic key. Of course, you already know what those two keys are in this piece, as well as you know the alphabet, so tell me next time we meet. We are now going to take a deeper look at the tonality and texture in the second subject of the exposition, and also talk about some compositional devices and techniques that are of interest and might come up in your exam. Now, as we already mentioned, this section is in the dominant key of E major, and that key is established with a perfect cadence. I want you now to listen to the beginning again and see if you can hear the point at which that key is firmly established. That happens with a perfect cadence, and also the pulse changes and becomes more regular. Try to listen carefully. I hope it was easy for you to hear that it was at this point here, bar 103 into 104, where there's a perfect cadence and the key of E major is firmly established. Let's hear it just one more time. Keep listening this time. Of course, what you just heard was the very familiar descending sequence that you hear all across the movement in the clarinet part. This time it ends with a virtuosic arpeggio run, and it's something, just a device you should be aware of in case you're asked about it in the exam. This is an arpeggio, it runs up in the clarinet part, and it's quite difficult to play. Let's hear this passage again, paying close attention to all the devices we talked about, starting with the descending sequence there. Okay, let's look at the next little section. We've just finished with a perfect cadence in E major, and suddenly the texture is very thin, with the solo clarinet supported only by violin 1 and 2, and we also shift to the key of C sharp minor, which is the relative minor of E major. The other thing to pay attention to is this dialogue between two registers of the same instrument, the upper register of the clarinet and the lower register. Let's have a listen. Now, these low notes, highlighted in red there, I referred to as the chalumeau register when talking about clarinet. Chalumeau is the name of a fairly ancient woodwind instrument that was used a lot in the Baroque era and was fairly small but had low mellow tones. Now, by having this sort of dialogue between the upper and lower register, Mozart is also giving the clarinetists an opportunity to show off their fantastic instrumental skills. Let's now hear what happens at the very end of this section, the second subject of the exposition. These last two bars establish a B7 chord, which is the dominant seventh of E major. As well as the decoration in the clarinet part and the pause, that creates enough tension for us to transcend comfortably to the first subject. As you know, the first subject that follows this part is played in the dominant key of E major. So we're back to the first subject and the last part of the exposition. Let's now briefly talk about the tonality and texture in the second subject of the recapitulation section. This is the second and last time this theme appears, and we're just going to look at a couple of differences between the second subject in recapitulation and the second subject in the exposition. Of course, there are many similarities between the two sections, and they start in a very similar way. But this time, in the recapitulation section, the second subject happens in the tonic key, and it is also established with a perfect cadence in the tonic key of A major. There you heard our sequence again, but this time you must have noticed that the relationship between different phrases is different. They're placed into different registers because we're in a different key. So some of them had to go up an octave, some of them had to go down an octave, but the content remains the same. Let's keep listening. Now, a very interesting thing is happening here. The melody you heard in the exposition, played by the clarinet, is now played by the violins, whilst the clarinet gets its own counter melody and takes advantage of the two registers, the upper register and the lower register, once again. Let's listen to this bit once more. Immediately afterwards, the two parts swap. Now the clarinet has the melody, and the violins the counter melody. With regard to the key, and texture, we are now in F sharp minor, the relative minor of A major, the tonic, and the texture is very similar to the previous time you heard this theme. It's the clarinet, supported by only violin 1 and 2. I want you to hear this whole part one more time. Pay attention to everything we've talked about, and also pay attention to the way it ends with a dominant E7 chord, the dominant seventh of A major, the tonic. That way we're brought comfortably back to the first subject, which you will now hear in the tonic key. And the first subject now returns, last time, recapitulation section. I hope this video has been useful to you, and I hope that you can watch it a few times. I hope you learned something. I hope that you can use it for your exam revision, and watch this space for more. Thank you very much.